This episode of Stand Up and Holler is brought to you by Thrive Fantasy. Come prop up on Thrive Fantasy this football season. Thrive Fantasy is a daily fantasy sports and esports app for player props. With Thrive, you can eliminate the countless hours of research and focus on only the top tier athletes that have the biggest impact on the game. Choose 10 out of the 20 available player props to build your lineup. Each prop is assigned a fantasy value for both the over and the under based on how likely it is to hit. Hit the most props and rack up the most points to win a share of the prize pool. Use promo code REACT when you sign up today, and you'll receive a 100% instant first deposit match up to $100. Download Thrive Fantasy on the App Store or Play Store or by visiting their website, www.thrivefantasy.com. Sign up and prop today.
I'm Nick Newton, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On tonight's episode, we will cover Dan Mullen is out as the University of Florida head football coach. How did this thing spiral so quickly? We'll ask that question. We'll break it down, and we'll go over potential options to replace Coach Mullen as the head coach. And finally, we'll wrap up with a quick look ahead to the Florida State game this weekend, because Will, despite all the drama this weekend and on Sunday here, we do have one more game remaining.
Yeah, I mean, bowl eligibility on the line, right? So it's not just one of those things where this is a throwaway game. It's a bunch of practices for guys who, quite honestly, obviously need to improve over the course of the next couple of months if they have the opportunity to. I won't have a new coach in at that point. It'll still be the old staff, but having that bowl opportunity, having those practices is a big deal for young players. And this team has a lot of young players who haven't necessarily got out on the field. Some of them actually played against Missouri, played pretty well. And so I think seeing that continued development, seeing those guys get more practices, I know it's not, the install for the scheme and that sort of stuff isn't there, but at the same time, just extra practice makes a difference. And, you always see that from year to year, sort of the bowl practices sort of set the tone for the next year.
Well, before we dive into two bits, there's not much to. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on covering the Missouri game here. When you got Eli Drinkwitz afterward trying to talk smack, dressed up like Darth Vader, and then drink a Diet Coke on the way out. I mean, when that dork's talking smack to your program, it might be time for a change. But what did you see from the Gators on Saturday?
I mean, I saw a team that fought. I think one of the things we wondered coming out of that Sanford game was whether the defense had found something maybe at halftime of that game. And I think they did find some stuff. I think they found some toughness. I think Tyron Hopper was awesome against Missouri. And I think Diabate was pretty good too. They gave up a couple of big plays, a couple of runs, especially there in the fourth quarter and in overtime to Batty that just wasn't going to, those sorts of things are going to happen for this defense because this defense is not elite, and you're going to have things where it doesn't go your way. But let's be honest, they gave up 16 points in regulation to Missouri. That's a game that Florida should win, and that's a game Dan Mullen should win every time because his offense, we've been told is able to put up 30, 35 points. And quite honestly, I'd bought into that. I suspected the defense might not be good enough, but the offense was going to be good enough to at least limit the how far the team fell from a floor perspective, and that's just not what happened.
Well, that's a good segue into two bits, where we'll talk about Dan Mullen being let go as the head coach at the University of Florida here. Some red flags that have been creeping up over the years. This was the type of thing that, people talked about different issues. You've been a voice out there harping on the recruiting. And when you're winning 10 games a year, it's easier to be dismissive over some of those concerns as maybe a little more minor. But hey, it turns out when you don't have a world-class quarterback and 2 first-round draft picks on your offense, some of those issues might get exposed. Well, this was a relationship. I equivocate this to a relationship that you have that you really want to work out, but it just doesn't. There's some relationships you can't get out of fast enough, and there's some that you're sad that are ending. I would put this in the latter for myself personally. Everybody can have their own personal opinion on that. But Mullen made so much sense when he came in. He was the offensive coordinator, Urban Meyer, who's going to bring the good times back. He had a good energy coming in to the program. I was really hyped to have him after years. I can remember the first press conference I saw with Jim McElwain, and my reaction was, "What did we just do?" I'm pretty sure McElwain gave a lecture about, talking about how the importance of brushing your teeth. And I didn't even know what he was talking about half the time, but we pick on McElwain a lot, but at the same time, those were some lean years, and Mullen brought in a different level of energy in the first 3 years. If you would have told me by the end of year 4 that Mullen was going to be fired, I would have been stunned. And I think that this was a great start. He brought good energy into the program, but it didn't translate into different areas of the program, and his reluctance to grow, his reluctance to make changes ultimately cost him his job.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you'd have told me at the beginning of this year that Mullen was going to lose his job, I certainly wouldn't have thought that. I would have thought that the danger with Dan Mullen actually was that you were going to end up with a team that played like Mark Richt, right? That you were going to be the Jim Harbaugh or the Georgia under Richt type of program, the Auburn of the East. Was sort of the destiny of a Dan Mullen coach team because of the recruiting. And I've been critical of the recruiting basically since 2018 when Read and Reaction started, really. And the reason is because you can see how much it correlates, but it's not just the recruiting, it's the relationships, it's the PR, it's all of the different things that sort of go into being a college head coach. That's really a lot different than an NFL head coach, because at a college and a big time program, you are the face of the program. These players cycle in every 3 or 4 years. And so, you get close to a few players, like Tebow has captured the imagination like nobody else. But you go look, I mean, people are enamored with Ciatric Faison. People are enamored with Lito Shepherd and those sorts of guys. I mean, we all sort of have those guys in our past who are like really, really fun guys. But if you ask people about the Florida program, they say Steve Spurrier and they say Urban Meyer. So the focus is on the coach. And that means that the relationship with the fans, with the media, and with the players all gets emphasized. And Dan Mullen just isn't really a relationship guy from everything that we know previous to coming to Gainesville. And now that the 4 years has cycled through, I think he did a lot of good things for the Florida program, right? I mean, I don't want to poo-poo the things that he did. The 10-3 season, the first year with Felipe Franks, I think was a really, really nice season. 11-2 the next year, only losing to Georgia, and then that Joe Burrow-led LSU team really sort of made me doubt whether some of the numbers that I was looking at were really all that accurate. Last year, that all sort of came back and bit because everything didn't hit all at the same time. And then Mullen this year at the press conference the other day talked about the 0-7 in the last 7 one-score games. And the problem is he was 6-1 in those first one-score games. And so you sort of had a mirage, right? The first 2 years were better than the team actually was. And the last 2 seasons, I think the record has ended up worse than the teams actually are. I think Florida is in a better place now than when Mullen took over under Jim McElwain. But the same problems that existed under Jim McElwain in many ways existed under Dan Mullen as well. And so, you looked at McElwain, second in the SEC his first 2 years, but I think he was 7-0 in one-score games in those 2 seasons. Mm-hmm. The bottom falls out in that third year, even though I think he won his first 2 one-score games in 2017 as well. But then LSU, Texas A&M, and then Georgia just put the end to it. Obviously, you've got the death threat stuff and that sort of stuff too. But at the end of the day, it was the same story. It was recruiting in that sort of 10 to 15 range. The first year, I think it was like 23rd, but then recruiting in that 10 to 15 range, winning a lot of one-score games, giving everybody hope, and then everything falling apart. We saw the same cycle repeat itself with Dan Mullen, just with somebody who I think is a better football coach than Jim McElwain. And he's going to he's going to end up on his feet somewhere else, whether it's as an offensive coordinator in the pros or whether it's as a head coach at a place like Washington or Virginia Tech or something like that. So, I feel sorry for him because anytime there's any sort of change like this, I mean, you want to see people succeed. At the same time, one of the reasons that we look at the numbers, one of the reasons we look at the analytics is to give us guidance in terms of how things are going. And this was always an experiment. It was an experiment as to whether Mullen could overcome those things where Jim McElwain was not able to do so. And obviously 2021 just sort of proved that the idea that Mullen was going to bring this floor that was impenetrable, where Florida was going to win eight games every year, was not accurate. And if you don't have that floor, then what are you doing if you can't reach the ceiling you want to reach either?
You talk about the mood around the program when he came in. We were so hungry. I mean, what was the phrase Strickland always used? We're going to make Florida football fun again, right? And we were so hungry to bring back the good times. And we were starved offensively. We saw Felipe Franks turn into a semi-competent quarterback, not the type of elite quarterback that Kyle Trask turned into, but we thought Mullen had this thing lined up. Hey, you got Trask, got Emory Jones. The quarterback position is one position that I think we can all agree that he did recruit very well, but it was the top to bottom roster. The issue I think that I saw particularly this year is some of the things. Some of the things with Mullen, there was definitely an attitude shift. There was definitely I'm pretty tired of answering these questions type of attitude in year 4 that didn't exist in year 1, when he was more willing to engage with some of these issues. And unfortunately, when you go through some difficult times like we've been through this year, that's the time where you probably need to be reaching out and engaging more. And he seemed to shut down more and more as the season went along, which I did not think played well from a PR standpoint. The other thing, Will, just the losses on the field with Kentucky for the second time in 4 years after 31 straight wins over the Wildcats. You had Missouri and South Carolina in the same season, all 3 of those in the same season, on top of the disappointment with Georgia, where it wasn't even remotely competitive. Alabama, I think we all walked away saying, okay, after the Alabama game. But those other games, and I didn't even talk about the LSU game and Samford, which were embarrassing in their own different respects. So, I mean, I really, most of the performances this year have just been overall stinkers. And it's tough to really even paint a rosy picture of almost anything that's happened this year. And it just didn't seem like he was able to show any type of recovery at all throughout the season, which is why I think that if we go into 4 bits here, that's part of the reason why this thing spiraled so quickly out of control. Those inconsistencies that were showing up at the end of 2020, those really cost us here in 2021. You saw the lack of discipline, and I know everybody talks about the shoe throw, but I'll go the shoe throw with LSU, the Cotton Bowl, where it was okay to not show up, and then retaining Todd Grantham. We're not going to hold you accountable to achieve at the highest levels here. So a lot of those things seeped into the program, into the psychology of the program. And I think we saw that on the field in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what you say is true, but I even go back to the hiring of Todd Grantham. If you looked at the analytics, you looked at what Grantham had done at previous stops, you said, this isn't a difference maker on defense. And then you looked, so that's your first strike. And then the second strike is that the recruiting, you're not bringing in top 3, top 4 classes, which is what you're going to need to compete with Alabama and Georgia on the field. So you had a guy who wasn't a difference maker at defensive coordinator that you brought in from day one. And then you stuck by him, obviously, for 4 years. And in many cases, I wrote this in my article today that Strickland's decision today had more to do, I think, with what he's been watching for the past year, right? Like the fan base was starting, and the Neubauer stuff colors that too, but the fan base was starting to move from Mullen to Strickland. In many ways, the way they moved from Grantham to Mullen this year, right? I mean, all off season long, we basically talked about how the transfer of responsibility went from Grantham to Mullen because Mullen decided to stick with Grantham. The same thing would have happened had Strickland decided to stick with Mullen, is that the transfer of responsibility would have switched. And so that's really all that happened here, right? I mean, but if you go back to it, Neil Blackman's talking about it being a toxic work environment under Todd Grantham after those guys are fired. And that's something that Mullen was, if not approving of, was at least allowing to occur. And the lack of leadership that the team showed in the first half against Samford was not necessarily something that Mullen is ultimately like fostering, but it's something that he's allowing to happen. Now, I think it's a good thing that these players, I think it says something about these players that they were able to gather and come out and play decently against Missouri on the defensive side of the ball. But then you look at the offense, and one of the questions that Mullen said that he was trying to answer when he got rid of Grantham and Hevesy was, are we better now than we were early in the season. And you look at the offensive statistics, you look at the quarterback play, you look at the offensive line play, you look at the wide receivers, and you can ask the exact same question about the offense. And the reality is Dan Mullen's the offensive coordinator.
Mhm.
And so if the offense isn't better from the beginning of the year to now, and offense is your calling card, well, then what's the selling point to the organization? What's the selling point to the boosters? What's the selling point to the fan if you're not recruiting at a level that gives people high hopes? I mean, if he was recruiting top 5 classes, then you stick with him, because even if you get rid of him next year, the next guy who comes in is loaded with talent, right? Sort of the Ron Zook, the Ron Zook plan. But the issue is that you don't have that. So then if you're not out scheming people offensively, and if your defensive coordinator is fostering an environment that people don't like and is toxic and is preventing leadership from occurring, what are you hanging your hat on? And that's the thing, is I think it became harder and harder for people who were Mullen defenders. And up until 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was one of them, thinking that he needed not another opportunity for next year, not because I agreed with his overall process, but because I think, to be fair to him, based on what he was trying to build, it made sense. But that was before he lost to LSU. That was before he lost to Georgia. That was before he lost to South Carolina. And that was before he lost to Missouri. And once when you spend a season losing to Kentucky, Missouri, and South Carolina at the University of Florida, that's no longer a talent thing, right? I mean, you can stomach a loss to Georgia and you can stomach a loss to Alabama, because you're going to lose to those teams from time to time, even if you have equivalent talent. But once you start losing regularly to Kentucky, once you start losing to Missouri, once you start losing to South Carolina, it's done. There's just no hope anymore that the out scheming, that the floor is not going to fall out. And that's what's happened this year. The floor's fallen out, and Mullen paid the price for it.
I'm always slow to question people's motivations at this level, because it's easy to say, oh, you see a lot of that out there with, oh, I don't know, does Dan Mullen even care about that? Of course, I think that's kind of silly to even ask those questions for the most part. But the fact that he seemed to draw that question so frequently is alarming this year. That was alarming, that you seem to. You had rumors about him maybe looking at why is our recruiting class down for 2022? Well, he's potentially looking at the NFL. Rumors around that in 2019 too, right? So it was kind of like he maybe had a wandering eye a little bit in terms of jobs. He's doing pretty well at turning Florida around, maybe looking ahead to the next step, not totally invested in what's going on the recruiting trail. And I'm only saying that based on the evidence on what we see, because I think we do a lot better on the recruiting trail than what we've done. But that could also come from a lot of the other symptoms of not getting rid of the guys you need to get rid of in a timely manner, not moving on to different. I mean, even on the field, Will, the quarterback situation alone, I think every Florida fan, I don't think any Florida fan has any ill will toward Emory Jones, but Anthony Richardson's gotten a raw deal this year. And I realize he's been injured the last couple of weeks, supposedly injured or supposedly having issues with different things. I don't know what's totally going on with that, but definitely he's been slow to bring him in and bring him about this season, even though he's clearly looked like the more talented quarterback. I think some of these things with Dan Mullen, I think these are all functions of inconsistencies with management. And that's a big thing to be labeled with if you're the CEO of the Florida Gators football program, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you got to make tough decisions, right? The Grantham decision was a tough decision. The Hevesy decision was a tough decision. And he waited until he was essentially forced to make those decisions to make them, right? I mean, I think it was Redmond had a story about Strickland basically telling him to make changes after the South Carolina game. That's when the changes finally happened. So, the implication there is that his arm was twisted, not that that was a change he knew he needed to make things better. And that is a problem in itself, but it's also indicative of, we've all looked at it and said, you need a quarterback who is elite to win consistently based on the recruiting profile, your team, what's going to happen. And what that means is the fan base isn't stupid. So the fan, I live up in Philly. I'm actually in Florida right now, but I live in Philly, and they've gone through this whole process thing with Sam Hinkie there. And there are a lot of people who hate that process, but I think they understand that you have to lose in order to get high draft picks. Now, whether you got to do it 7 straight years like they did in Philly is a different question. But they have Joel Embiid now because they went through all that losing. And so people were willing to go through that if they saw the benefit on the other side. And I think that's the thing that was missing from the decision making, is that, it's like, hey, we're going to put the guy out there who gives us the best chance to succeed today against Kentucky, or today against Alabama, or today against LSU, when the fan base is really looking at it and saying, look, I get that you want to win today, but the reality is that we're in, especially once Florida lost a couple of games, we're interested in understanding, how do we win big in 2022? And the minute you start saying, no, I'm going to be conservative, no, I'm going to leave a guy out there on the field who's good but not great. I think Emory Jones, actually, you look at his statistics, he played really, really well. Red zone, he's really been bad. Like they've been poor at converting in the red zone. And so they haven't scored as many points as maybe the underlying statistics indicate that they should have. But that's all part and parcel to having a guy out there and doing that sort of stuff. And, it was sort of exemplified yesterday against Missouri, where they had 1st and goal from the 2. And Damian Pierce wasn't out there, and Anthony Richardson wasn't out there. So your 2 big guys who are power runners, neither one of them is out there. And so, yeah, I think that there were questions there, but it's always about vision, right? I mean, we talk about recruiting, and recruiting is important, but if you could sell me a vision in how you were going to use the facilities, and how you're going to use increased funds, and how you were going to use relationships, different high schools, to build a recruiting apparatus that would rival some of the guys that you're going after, then I think everybody buys in. But just this wishful thinking that all of a sudden a facility that matches what Alabama's doing, or matches what Clemson's doing, or matches what Georgia's doing is going to give significantly better results, I think people look at that and go, no, you're not selling me the vision. And so that's what I sort of question overall. And I think that's what the quarterback position, even the running back position, is sort of indicative of, is that you have to cast a vision for a program, not cast a vision for a win over Tennessee. And the win over Tennessee is important because those wins are building blocks to get to where you need to go. But I think everybody in Gator Nation is willing to accept slightly less results now for significantly better results later. We want to fly a flag. And so, and that's sort of what Urban Meyer was able to do, right? I mean, he had some misses. They were 5th, I think, the first year in the SEC, but then they won the national championship. Then they were 7th the next year, but then they won a national championship. Then they were 2nd the year after, and then I think they were 7th or 8th again in his last year there. So there were some highs and there were some lows with Urban Meyer there, but the highs were so significant that you're waving your flag and you're bragging to your friends, and obviously that makes a difference. And then, so that vision, I think, is the thing that was missing. And then the buy-in to the overall organization from the standpoint of, I don't like, the Missouri game should be a given. The Georgia game needs to be the emphasis, right? The Kentucky game should be a given. Florida State needs to be the emphasis. And do you care about beating the rivals as much as we do? I think is the other thing that sort of, again, when you think about vision, when you think about how do you get people to buy in, that's one of the things. I mean, Spurrier wasn't stupid. One, he hated Georgia because he'd been at Florida. But that whole thing picking on Georgia, talking about how he liked playing them, early in the season when he was at South Carolina because they always had somebody suspended. The part where he talked about, they always had the better players when people recruit, but then we go out there and kick their butt. Like that sort of stuff was designed. That's not for the players. That's not for anybody other than the people in Gainesville who support the program, who want to go laugh and josh and needle their friends from Georgia. And we never got that opportunity, right? And the fact that the era ends with Eli Drinkwitz doing that essentially back to Florida is one of those things where, one, I think it's kind of funny, but two, I want my coach to be doing that after he's won the game. And we just haven't seen that, obviously.
He's just got no game. Eli Drinkwitz, man. Did you see that little smile he had too as he's grabbing his Diet Coke and drinking it and walking away? I'm like,
well, on the bright side, when the new guy comes in and whips him, I think it'll get. I don't even want that to be an intense rivalry.
It was
right. It just needs to be 42-0 from here on out.
It objectively was a funny move on Eli Trinkwitz's part, but can you talk smack and then drink a can of Diet Coke right after? That's my real question. It's not the look he thought it was. I'm just gonna say it like that. I do, again, like at the end of the day though, Will, do you think this is with what you saw with your concerns with recruiting over the last few years, are you surprised I think you're surprised that we've arrived at this destination already, But are you surprised we're here in general? Or was this the expectation when you were sounding the alarm about recruiting for the last couple of years?
And I think this is the expectation. The expectation was Georgia was always going to get it together, that they'd eventually find a quarterback to supplement their talent, and then they'd be like Alabama. And
five-star kid Stetson Bennett just killing.
Well, but again, you think about Mac Jones last year. He was not a five-star guy at Alabama. Now he's starting to win games for the Patriots. So it's not necessarily that you have to find a quarterback from that pedigree. I think it helps, but I don't think you necessarily have to find a guy with that pedigree. But you got to find a guy. And even these elite teams with elite level talent have now decided they're going to spread things out. And they're going to find guys who are gunslingers back there, and they're going to score points. So the days of being able, Dave Wunderlich wrote a really good article over Gator Country, I think today, maybe last week, but it was something along the lines of Mullen sort of grew up in the era where you could out scheme your opponents because the spread was not common. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that that Nick Saban did when he brought in Lane Kiffin was he said, I understand that we need to go learn. There's a really good article on ESPN about that Kiffin and Saban marriage right before Alabama beat Ole Miss. And the thing was Kiffin didn't know the spread either. So Kiffin and Saban went and basically learned the spread offense and took the principles that they wanted to apply to Alabama to their superior athletes and said, okay, now we have the spread. And we have a defense that can stop the spread because they stop them every day in practice. And we're going to recruit athletes to fit that profile. So now bringing in the spread, Rich Rodriguez hasn't been any good since West Virginia. And one of the reasons his teams haven't been any good since West Virginia is because he was taking people by surprise when he was at West Virginia with that spread offense. And if you gave him the exact same personnel now, defenses would know how to stop it. And defenses would have linebackers who were fast enough to stop Pat White on the edge and those sorts of things. And so the schematic advantage has decreased. I'm not saying that Mullen doesn't provide a schematic advantage. I'm saying it's decreased and that the other coaches are not stupid. And I think, the thing about recruiting is not necessarily that recruiting is everything, but it's that you can't ignore it. And so, I remember when the Cubs won the World Series in 2016, there was a guy, Randy Gizzarelli, who's a analytics guy. He's actually a dentist a dermatologist who writes about baseball in his spare time. But he basically said that the battle when it came to the arguments over analytics was never between the guys with analytics and people gut instincts or the scouts. It was between the curious and the incurious. So if we're going to take a look, the reason we take a look at the numbers is to say, okay, I'm going to be curious enough to look at this and see where we stand. And then, hey, it's an experiment, right? And in this case, we had just seen the experiment with Jim McElwain. So when you asked me whether I thought that this was the inevitable result, yeah. And in fact, most coaches have a down year in year 3, and Mullen papered over that with the transfer portal. And that was maybe my one hope at his ability to sort of weather that storm, is that you'd have enough transfers hit that you'd be able to weather that storm, get your own recruits in, get everybody trained up. And by the time you hit year 4 and year 5, things would be really smoothly oiled and running. And that just didn't happen at the quarterback position this year. And then it didn't happen with the transfers either. I mean, you look at guys like Brenton Cox, look at guys like Justin Shorter, you look at the guys on the defensive line they brought in, and everybody that they brought in 18 and 19 hit. And everybody that they brought in 21 didn't. And so that is the danger, is that when you're thin from a talent perspective, it's not that you don't have guys out there who are contributing. It's that you need stars. And stars come from the top 50 guys in the country every year who are recruited in high school. And that just isn't what's happened at Florida in this particular era.
And even though the mighty University of Florida is capable of having a down year every once in a while, you usually can, if you can sell some hope on the other side of it, you get that shot. You're not seeing the hope though right now.
No, I mean, the other thing is that we talk a lot about the Gator standard, and Steve Spurrier has set an almost impossible standard. And Urban Meyer came close, but really not that close, because Spurrier, if you look at his record, best record in the SEC in 1990, 1991, 1993, 94, 95, 96, and 2000. Second best record in 92, 98, 99, and 2001. Third best record in 1997. That was the worst year that he ever had as a coach, was third in the SEC. So he had 7 firsts, though in 1990 they were ineligible, 4 seconds and a third. And if you look at Mullen, 4th in 2018, 3rd in 2019, 2nd in 2020, and now 13th in 2021. And that tracks very similarly to Jim McElwain, 2nd in 15, 2nd in 16, 11th in 2017. And it tracks with where things were probably headed with Ron Zook, where he went 3rd, 5th, and 5th. But, people were upset with Zook for third, fifth, and fifth, and fourth, third, second, and 13th really isn't that different. In fact, it's a much lower average overall from an SEC finish perspective. Spurrier set a really impossible almost standard to meet. So to come in talking about the Gator standard, I think may actually be maybe a mistake for the next coach. I think the coach needs to. I want the next coach to come in and talk about process. Talk about the process, get me to buy into the process, get the fans to buy into the process, get the fans to buy into this is how we're going to build things. And then deliver on that process, right? So one of the things we have to do is recruit. 10th ain't good enough. We're going to recruit at a level that puts us in the top 2 or 3 in the SEC and then deliver.
So let me understand this correctly, Will. You want the coach to talk to you about process, but then win like Spurrier, right?
Well, I mean, that is the Gator standard. But I mean, I guess my point.
I thought we weren't talking about that. No, I understand. Hey, that's why Mullen's losing his job today. That's why he's losing the job, because the fact is you're at a place that does not sit back and say we're okay just constantly being second fiddle to Georgia, third fiddle to Alabama, if that. Like, I mean, Alabama right now. We are no different than an Auburn that pops up once in a while and has a great year and then goes back down for a couple of years. Like, that's where we are. That's the cycle we're in right now. We saw LSU pop up and go blast to the moon, and then they came all the way back to earth, and then some with Coach O. We saw that too. But even LSU, what they say, this isn't acceptable. We want more consistency out of our program. We think we're capable of more consistency. You heard Scott Strickland talk about that today, that consistency. And that's what we haven't seen in the last year or two. It's okay. I think we can survive. A coach can survive fine here, going 8-4 once in a while. But it's the dramatic inconsistency with even some of the wins that we've had that I think is the ultimate undoing here.
Sure. And I mean, I've said this all season long, which is that, Spurrier set an incredibly high bar. Saban has set an incredibly high bar. And it's interesting. He was much more inconsistent when he was at LSU. He was still great at LSU, but he was much more inconsistent. It wasn't until he sort of streamlined what he wanted to do when he came to Alabama that he was able to build that juggernaut. And I think he was probably able to take some of the things that he said, hey, this is a mistake that I made when I was at LSU, or a way I wouldn't have done something. I'm actually reading the book right now. I think the title is How Bad Do You Want to Win? And it's an autobiography by Saban. He talks about that LSU team falling flat the year before they won the national championship, and they gave up a long pass against I think it was Arkansas, to lose a game. And he said, that's when we won the national championship the next year, because everybody dedicated themselves to the tiny little details. Everybody dedicated themselves to getting a little bit better, to not getting outworked one day over the course of the entire year. And that's really, I think, the thing that you're going to look for. The reality is that this job and what it requires, and winning the SEC and winning the national championship, requires a sacrifice. And Kirby Smart talked about that after the Florida game, that his family has sacrificed when it comes to giving him the time and the ability to build the relationships with people he needs to build relationships with in order to build Georgia to where it is. And we'll see whether that turns into a championship for Georgia. But it has required sacrifices. And the question is, are you willing to make those sacrifices? And one of those sacrifices is making changes when you don't want to make them, but they're the right change to make. One of those is, looking at taking a hard look at the program and saying, I need to make changes. One of them is taking a look at the defensive coordinator who you'd be comfortable with when you bring him in day one and say, you know what, I'm going to take a risk and go with somebody I'm not comfortable with, because not being comfortable is actually a healthy thing. And all of those things are things that Dan Mullen did not do in his time at Florida. And look, I mean, he's been compensated well for it. He's won a lot of games. He's made the program more fun, certainly, than it was under Jim McElwain or Will Muschamp. Definitely. But obviously it is not good enough for what people at Florida are looking for. Yeah. And that's okay too, right? I mean, I think we look at this. I mean, I've been a little bit sad about it today, because I never want to see somebody lose their job. But I think sometimes we look at separations as like these just horrible things, but sometimes separations are good for both parties. And, you get to a point where we weren't going to get any better than we were last year, really. That was sort of or maybe the year before, that was sort of the ceiling for the program. And that ceiling is not acceptable to a large portion of the Gator fan base and a large portion of the boosters. And certainly Scott Strickland made it clear that it's not acceptable to him. So the separation is natural. This is one of those things where you've gotten the program to a place where I think it's better off than it was under Jim McElwain. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And in fact, we talked a little bit about a month ago about the analytics separation between Florida's results and their actual, their on-field results and their actual underlying analytics with the S&P. And certainly they dropped quite a bit, losing to South Carolina and Missouri in the S&P. But I think they're still a top 25 team in that S&P, which says that there are underlying statistics to say this team is better than that team in McElwain's 3 years, really, because the team was always sort of a bottom tier S&P team, bottom of the top 25 each of those 3 years. And I think like 50th in 2017 when he left. So the team is better off than it was, but the team is not where the fan base expects it to be. And so this is a natural place to have a separation where you can just say, look, thank you for what you've done. We appreciate what you've done, but you'll be happier someplace else and we'll be happier that you're someplace else. And so it's a good time to make that separation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think the vast majority of the fan base does like Coach Mullen. I think it has been a good ride for the most part. And then the last year, it's been nutty the last year. So obviously a lot had to happen in the last year to get to this place, but I hope we broke down some of that for y'all. And, we got all off season to really dig into the details more, but for now, let's start looking ahead, Will. Let's break down potential options to replace Coach Mullen. And I'm going to give you some categories of what I broke it down to, and you can react to each category, all right?
Sure.
The first category, I'm going to call it the super unlikely. More so, I actually rather you just stop mentioning their name altogether. Stop talking about Bob Stoops and Urban Meyer for the job ain't going to happen. What do you think about that?
I think you can stop talking about Urban Meyer for the job. I think you should at least keep Bob Stoops in mind.
All right, so then you would probably put Bob Stoops in the oft-rumored names but unlikely category, maybe. Matt Campbell, I'm going to throw in there. Dave Aranda, James Franklin, Mario Cristobal, David Shaw, and Kyle Whittingham.
And what category are you calling these guys in?
The oft-rumored but unlikely.
I mean, Cristobal obviously sort of hurt his case with that loss the other night because the narrative is going to be, he's able to recruit, but can he actually get the job done on the field? I think Cristobal be a really good recruiter out there. Who else you got on that list?
I got Matt Campbell from Iowa State. I think he's just got a lot of Midwest connections. Matt Campbell, I think, is waiting for that Big Ten job. You always hear that with him. James Franklin, his name is in on every single job. And honestly, that would drive me nuts if he came to Florida and we had to listen to that. I love the job Dave Aranda's done at Baylor, but I think he ultimately, when LSU gets off of this pipe dream for Jimbo, I think Dave Aranda might end up being their guy. Probably come down between Dave Aranda and Billy Napier potentially. David Shaw is a name you heard for NFL jobs a long time. I think he gets lost on the West Coast a lot. I personally am not a huge David Shaw fan. I think he's ultra conservative. That's not my thing, but he's been highly successful out there at Stanford. And one of the most underrated coaches in America at Utah is Kyle Whittingham.
Yeah, I think Whittingham would be, I really, really liked the hire at Auburn this year with Harsin because what he was doing out at Boise State, I don't think you win at that level without having real chops. I think Whittingham has stayed a long time at Utah. He hasn't necessarily reached the heights of Urban Meyer, but that's a difficult place to win. So I like him in some perspectives. I think some of the other guys, Aranda, only a couple of years at LSU or a couple of years at Baylor, a poor year last year and then a good year this year. Is that really enough? I mean, that's something I guess.
Great track record as a high level defensive coordinator.
Absolutely. But, you look at Baylor, they were like the number 12 or 13 team under Matt Rule in 2019. Aranda comes in 2020. Obviously you've got all the COVID stuff going on, things like that, but then they go 2-9. So a rough first year. And I'm not necessarily feeling that. I think, one of the things that Urban Meyer taught us is that special coaches win significantly at the site that they're at. And so that's sort of, I tag him off on that one. Yeah, I think for the most part, I'm not real excited about those guys you've listed there. I mean, I just think
I got more for you. All
right, that's good. We're gonna go through them because nobody in that one really tickled the itch I'm looking for there, buddy.
All right, so divisive but potentially effective hires. These are hires that I think fans will have a reaction to one way or another, but I think they could do a good job. at the University of Florida. Your boy Lane Kiffin, number one, out of the gate. I think Lane Kiffin, think back to 2009 when Lane Kiffin takes the Tennessee job. If I even told you there was a part of the fan base that would remotely want him a decade later as a coach at Florida, that would shock a lot of people. Yet here we are with Lane Kiffin being a serious contender among the fans anyway.
I think Kiffin sort of checks that box in terms of his ability to improve both recruiting and winning percentage. So he improved the winning percentage at FAU significantly compared to Charlie Partridge, who was there before. He obviously has really sort of revamped what's going on at Ole Miss, though the Matt Corral addition there is not necessarily Kiffin's doing. Mm-hmm. And so, the question there is, did he get lucky and fortunate, right? Not lucky. Was he fortunate that he happened to run into a quarterback who's able to build Ole Miss to a status that they haven't been before? And his recruiting class this year, not all that great. Is he going to be able to recruit consistently? But there's going to be a little bit of that Spurrier edge. He's absolutely going to go after Kirby. Out of all the things now, and he's got that Saban background now where he could sort of rely on, the reason I'm doing this is because this is the way Saban does it, or we set up this particular process because this is the way Saban does it. I think that makes a big difference to be able to fall back on, this is the way the guy who's been most successful in this conference does it. And so we're doing it that way. Whether he'll give Saban that specific credit, I think that's a message you can get out through various channels and various media members in Gainesville. And
plus we had two Sabanites that didn't work out so well in Gainesville. So that might not carry the weight here that it carries in other places.
Look, I don't think Lane Kiffin is perfect. I don't think he's a sure thing. I don't think he's a home run, but I think the reward that you might get from a guy like Lane Kiffin is significant, and he could be a national championship coach. The risk is that you're going to bottom out at some point because this fan base is going to annihilate him when he says things that are stupid,
like
after a loss. In many cases,
Dan Mullen, I think he profiles very similarly to Dan Mullen. A lot of things that drove us nuts about Mullen will drive us nuts about Kiffin in the down years. If things were good and cooking, Kiffin's a lot of fun. When things go down, I don't know about his ability to make things recover, and that's what I question about him. But we're calling this the divisive but potentially effective hires, right? Well, the other one I'm going to throw out there, and it's a name you're not as crazy about, but PJ Fleck at Minnesota. He's done some good things at Minnesota. He's the high energy guy. He's got the row of the boat. He's a guy that I think people are either going to love or hate. And I think he's done a pretty good job with that Minnesota program. I know they haven't had the consistent results over the last couple of years that you'd like to see, but even today, they're still in the hunt for the Big Ten West out there at Minnesota this season. And that's saying a lot for a program that was pretty terrible when he took it over.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm not real high on this is because I'm basically looking at it and saying, how is this any different than winning 6 or 7 or 8 games at Mississippi State? Right. He went 11-2 in 2019, had really good quarterback play that year. I think the kid's name is Morgan, had really good quarterback play in 2019. And now you're 3-4 last year and 7-4 this year, 5-7 and 7-6 in his first 2 years. And so he's 33-23 overall, 20-22 in the Big Ten. Has he beaten Ohio State?
No.
Has he beaten Michigan? Maybe last year.
I don't know for sure. I know
they
lost last year in 2020 to open the season in Michigan. Yeah, they beat Penn State. He beat Penn State.
But I mean, are we talking like, is this one of those 2-8 against the teams you have to beat to win your conference?
Oh, Minnesota. The same argument
I guess
defending Mullen with Michigan State.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm saying one of the things that I learned, I was a late convert to the removal of Jim McElwain. And one of the reasons is I wasn't paying attention to all the recruiting stuff. That's one of the reasons I got into it. It's one of the reasons I looked at it first when Mullen came in, is because I learned my lesson. And so now we've had Mullen come in from Mississippi State, and the implication was, hey, he's going to recruit better because he's at Florida than he ever did at Mississippi State. And he improved the recruiting at Mississippi State a little bit, but that was a little bit of a mirage because Sylvester Croom was not a very good recruiter there. And so, I'm looking at 33-23 at a Power 5 job that is not a premium Power 5 job, but is a Power Five job and not necessarily and not being able to take on the big dogs. It's the same story. And so you're going to have to show me real recruiting numbers. And I don't have them sitting here in front of me, but you're going to have to show me real recruiting numbers that the guy before PJ Fleck at Minnesota was way, way worse, both from a record perspective and also from a record perspective and also from a recruiting perspective, because I don't think that necessarily floats when you start looking at that. I think what you're going to find is that the recruiting is probably kind of on par. And so if that's the case with the previous guy, and if that's the case, then no thanks.
Yeah. And keep in mind, these names are supposed to draw a little bit of disgust. They're not home run. They're not home run. Divisive, but potentially effective hire. Number 3, Greg Schiano at Rutgers. Rutgers, again, a name you couldn't imagine even floating a couple years ago. But Will, you want to talk about recruiting? Rutgers is currently, in 2022, they got the number 24 class in the country, 5th in the Big Ten. 4 4-star recruits, but Schiano coached a couple of years at Ohio State after his NFL days. He coached a couple of years as Urban Meyer's defensive coordinator at Ohio State, and he's been the only guy that's ever given Rutgers football a heartbeat. The NFL ties, the ability, a lot of his Rutgers teams were built off of recruiting South Florida pretty well. Coached the Miami Hurricanes back in the days, got connections in South Florida. I think Greg Schiano, not a name that anybody's going to jump up and be like, we got Schiano, but could he be potentially effective?
I got to be honest, I like this one. This is one of those where I just say, look, I think this one's pretty decent.
Plus, you can rub it in Tennessee's face. I forgot that.
That would absolutely be fun. I think one of the things you do have to recognize is that when he was in his first run at Rutgers, they were not in the Big Ten. Right. Yes. So like if you look at his 11-2 record in I think it was
strong schedule
2006, number 3 Louisville, they were able to beat, but then they lose at Cincinnati the next week. They lost at number 15 West Virginia. Those were the 3 ranked teams that Cincinnati wasn't a ranked team. So Louisville and West Virginia were the only ranked teams that they played. So not a strong schedule. At the same time, I mean, good grief. Like he starts off 2-9, 1-11, then 5-7, 4-7, then 7-5, 11-2, 8-5, 8-5, 9-4, then a 4-8 year and a 9-4 year, 68-67 at Rutgers. And now he's come back 3-6 and 5-6. And like you mentioned, able to recruit, certainly NFL experience, somebody that Bill Belichick likes and respects, and, a little bit of baggage, but not really that much considering what sort of has come out since the Tennessee fans went nuts and sort of prevented him from being Clay Travis out of Knoxville there. But it's interesting. They sort of went in the wilderness for a little while after they decided not to go with Schiano, certainly with Pruitt, and now maybe coming out of it a little bit with Heupel. I don't hate this one. This is one where I look at and I go, look, I think my argument against Fleck is that Minnesota is sort of a mid-tier Big Ten team. Like that's a team that, they're not great, but they're not like hamstrung. It's not like it's the Northwestern job, like with Pat Fitzgerald or something like that, where Northwestern was just bad for years. It's not Indiana. They're okay, not great, but okay. And plus they're sort of a model for winning there. If you look at Wisconsin right across the way, there's no model for winning at Rutgers. And I actually think Rutgers being able to tap into that New York market is sort of an interesting thing. But Schiano has a lot of South Florida recruiting experience, right? So if you're interested in relationship building, if you're interested in making sure that you understand how to get into those high schools, I think he's a guy who knows how to do that. And certainly if anybody who can sell Rutgers should be able to sell Florida.
A lot of good high school football in Jersey too. And some of those kids, I mean, recent players, Jabril Peppers, no Sean Marino back in the day. He's out of Jersey. There's a lot of good kids that are from Jersey that tend to leave the state and don't even give Rutgers a sniff. Schiano's making some of those kids give him a second look when they didn't have a pulse without him. So it's interesting to see what he's done there. A name that you brought up that made me squirm the other day that, hey, if you look at his straight coaching resume, but the guy has a clear resume, but I mean, are we going to seriously, in the divisive but potentially effective category, Will, are we seriously considering Hugh Freeze here?
It's interesting. I go back to that Saban book. How bad do you want to win? Like if that's the title, then look, Ole Miss, he was 12-25, but that's when you look at all the games that they actually made him give up. Right. He's 25-10 at Liberty.
And why did they make him give it up?
Well, they made him give it up because they didn't have NIL back then. So he didn't get fired because of recruiting violations. He got fired because he was doing things on his cell phone that he shouldn't have been doing. And that's what they used to get rid of him. Now, getting rid of him might have been tied in with the fact that they were worried about some of the things that were coming down the pike from a recruiting perspective. And look, he, in 2016, he went 5-7. So it's not like he was above reproach, but he went 10-3, 9-4, 8-5, and 7-6, and was able to recruit at Ole Miss. Now, the only thing I would say to that is if you're looking for a guy who can win 10 wins at Ole Miss, that guy already exists and he's already at Ole Miss and probably has less baggage than Freeze does. But I don't think there's any doubt Freeze knows how to recruit and Freeze knows how to sell. Whether or not the boosters want to go that route, I think is something that's probably a little bit doubtful. At the same time, again, it comes back to how bad do you want to win? If he's clearly the best candidate, I would say they're going to go with him. But I don't think he's the best candidate when you start looking at the names that are out there.
I think the history of the athletic department says we don't even sniff them. That's my opinion on that one. Bill O'Brien, offensive coordinator currently at Alabama, longtime Texans coach, did a great job at Penn State after they got hit hard with sanctions. And that I think for all of those of you who think of him as the Texans, the underachieving Texans coach, they did win a lot of AFC South. They appeared in a lot of playoff games, didn't do much in the playoffs with the Texans, and that run came to a disastrous end when he general managed his way out of town pretty quickly last season in Houston, and they're currently one of the worst teams in football because of a lot of his decisions. However, I think the guy's going to get a job in this cycle. I think he's going to interview. The guy pulled Penn State, he pulled an NFL job, and he's currently sitting in the Saban rehab clinic. I think that's going to get him a stamp for some kind of big job. I personally do not want him at Florida. I don't need the whole I just don't think his act plays well at Florida. And but if you want to talk about just an effective football coach, potentially effective, Bill O'Brien might be one of those guys. It wouldn't excite me at all, though.
No, I'd hate it.
Yeah.
Like the fact that he general managed his way out of the Texans says that the CEO title is problematic.
Yep.
Right. So again, if you want somebody who can coach but has trouble as a CEO, we've played that game, and no thanks.
Someone's going to get intoxicated with that Saban fairy dust, though. I'm going to just blow through these names here real quick before we get to the final bit of the real candidates here. The under the radar but could work candidate, Bill Clark from UAB. Probably not, again, a name that a lot of people would have to go through and look at. Been very good at UAB. Building a resume currently, but may not be the fit for Florida right now. Will Healy, if you go look back at his Austin P days, he's doing good things at Charlotte right now. Jeff Traylor, unbeaten UTSA. Tyson Helton at Western Kentucky. Go look at what they're doing on offense right now up at Western Kentucky. His record's not amazing. Not sold on his recruiting at all from what I've seen, but he's got a really bright young offensive coordinator they hired out of Houston Baptist, and they're doing interesting things this season. Kalani Sitake at BYU. I think I'm hearing him more connected out west for jobs. He seems to be more of a West Coast guy. In the assistant pool, I looked all defense on here. Dan Lanning from Georgia, Marcus Freeman from Notre Dame, Jim Leonard from Wisconsin, Brent Venables. I think none of them are super likely for this job. So, Will, let's finalize. I got 3 serious contenders for the job. Number 1, I'm going to throw out Coastal Carolina, Jamie Chadwell.
Yeah, I think he's done a really nice job at Coastal Carolina. I don't think he's even close to the top guy when it comes to that. They run sort of a unique offense there at Coastal. And I think you'd even mentioned on one of our bonus episodes that there's some stuff from a previous stop.
Charleston Southern.
From Charleston Southern from a recruiting perspective that might be looked down upon, considering all of the issues that Mullen had supposedly from some of the boosters and the UAA when it came to his show cause penalty. So Chadwell, I think, is an excellent coach, but when I look at his numbers, he actually comes in a little bit under from a winning percentage. So I broke down a bunch of the guys who might have the opportunity to coach. And I basically said, all right, what did they do did they make a difference? So when they came in, did they win more than their predecessor? Because, you figure in that transition year, maybe you have an equal record or a little bit worse, and you start looking at, did they win more? So Chadwell's won 17% more than his predecessor there, Coastal Carolina. Then the question is, what's his overall win percentage? And for Chadwell, it's 59% when I did this analysis. It might be a little bit higher now. And then the question is, what's the
Is
recruiting
that a
change compared?
coastal or is that in his FCS days too?
That's a coastal.
Okay.
So then you look at recruiting change. He did improve the recruiting by like 21 spots, but from a percentage perspective, that's not very much because it's like from 120 to 100. So yes, he improved recruiting. So clearly he's going to put some emphasis there. Winning right on the border of what might be acceptable. He's probably over 60% now, and he did improve the win. So I don't hate it, but I think there are better options out there.
Serious contender number 2, Luke Fickell, Cincinnati.
I like this one. He took over for Tommy Tuberville. He's won more than 75% of his games. I think he's up to 78% now. That puts him at a 21% difference compared to Tuberville. And then he's recruited at a 12 clip, an average of 12 spots better than Tuberville in his time there at Cincinnati. So clearly has had an uptick in recruiting. He's won a lot, and he's won more than Tuberville did. Those are sort of the three boxes I want to check. I don't know that he's the sexy hire, mainly because everybody remembers the year that he had at Ohio State. And that year at Ohio State was not a real successful year for Ohio State.
Very difficult year. Jim Tressel gets fired late. I think maybe it was even was it April it came out or June? It was a very turbulent offseason where Jim Tressel ends up getting fired with the recruiting the tattoo gate up in Columbus, where the players were selling their memorabilia for tattoos, and Fickell gets thrown in. He was a Buckeye on the team in the 90s, a defensive lineman. So he gets thrown in as the loyal alumni to serve as the interim coach in a difficult situation that year. He went 6-6.
The other reason this one doesn't really work is because Fickell's going to be playing the playoff, and he's not leaving a playoff team in order to come to a team that he can potentially turn into a playoff team. Right. And so if you're Florida, you need a guy in place by December. Yeah, so that he can get out there and make sure that early signing day, he's bringing in guys, because nobody is going to commit to your team early signing day if you don't have a head coach, and no one is going to wait past early signing day if they have multiple options. And so Florida has to have someone in place by then, and Fickell's going to be preparing for the playoff. I don't see really any way unless Cincinnati slips. And if Cincinnati slips, then you're going to have a portion of the fan base that looks at it and says, well, he can't even, he had a clear road with an easy schedule, couldn't get it done. And questions that. So I think Fickell's actually probably not one of the leading candidates because of where Cincinnati is right now.
Excellent points there. He's also very tied into the Midwest. We talked about the Ohio State roots, and his AD is the AD that hired him at Cincinnati is currently the AD at Southern Cal. So if anything, he's got a connection out there to maybe. So he's not totally tied down here, but he's done a good job of building relationships up in that part of the country. Think probably more of a Big Ten fit for him. But do I think he would do well with this Florida job? Yes, I do. But that's a great point about the playoffs. And that leaves me with my final series contender, Will. I'm going to go with Billy Napier from Louisiana Lafayette. We were texting a lot about the candidates, and this was one I freaked out early on about because I saw in 2012, he was the quarterback coach at Colorado State under Jim McElwain. We should all know this going in before we sign off on Billy Napier, but it's hard to ignore the resume. He's got a great resume, and he's done a great job building Louisiana up. He's improved the program there. They're winning 10 games a year almost with him. He's contending for conference titles, and he recruits. He's one of the best recruiters in the Sun Belt. They're consistently, if not the top, one of the top 2 classes in the Sun Belt every single year. This guy's been very picky. He's turned down a bunch of jobs. I believe he turned down Auburn, South Carolina. There's rumors he's already turned down Virginia Tech. Apparently, he's very picky and he knows what he wants. And so if he comes in and he signs off to work for Florida, it's because Florida can give him what he wants to work here. And I think you talk about a guy with a vision and a plan. That sounds like Billy Napier to me.
Napier's probably my favorite out of everybody. I think he's the favorite of a lot of different people. There's some stuff out there today. I think it was at The Athletic talking about how he's built up the recruiting offices there at Louisiana, how he doesn't necessarily have the resources that are necessary or the resources that they have at Alabama, but that he's foregone salaries so that he can make sure his assistants and his analysts get paid, so that he has solid people in those positions so that they can make sure they go out and get the best players for Louisiana. And he's gone 38-12. So he's won 76% of his games. That's 16% above the previous guy there at Louisiana, Mark Hudspeth. He's recruited 15 spots better than Hudspeth did. over
Wow.
his tenure there. So obviously, again, Louisiana, not a recruiting hotbed, but still an emphasis on recruiting and improving the recruiting. So he's done that there. I think Napier at 42 years old also makes sense from the standpoint of you're looking for a young, energetic guy who can energize the fan base. He's going to be high on a lot of people's lists when they look at who might come in. Certainly a limited resume at 38-12. But a resume where 7-7 his first year, 11-3 his second year, 10-1 and 10-1. And you want a guy who wins, that's about as close to an Urban Meyer resume. Like, in fact, if you look at the Bowling Green combination for Urban Meyer, if you combine Bowling Green and Utah, I bet you're going to find that that's pretty similar to what you've seen from Billy Napier the last 4 years.
I'm with you. I think Billy Napier's got to be the top choice for the Gators. And for those of you who aren't super excited about it, dig into him more, read about him more. I think you will come around. Because I did. I wasn't super excited at first about that, like looking at the market, but I do think that he could do a real good job with the University of Florida football program. Will, the last category. Hey, Nick, you're an idiot, and you forgot to mention my favorite guy. You got any other guys to mention?
So I think Joe Brady obviously is going to come up with what he was able to do there at LSU. Now he's the offensive coordinator at the Carolina Panthers. Has to work with Sam Darnold, and Cam Newton might be willing to sort of say, let's see what I can do as a head coach in college. I don't know where he wants to end up, but certainly Brady fits that young mold of somebody who has a reputation as being somebody who can come in and win. Not necessarily the track record of some of these other guys. Hasn't been a head coach yet. That might be one of the issues. Eric Bieniemy at the Kansas City Chiefs offensive coordinator, for whatever reason, has not gotten a head coaching job in the NFL. I think he probably will think it's beneath him and this isn't a shot at Florida. I think he'll think it's a bad move to be an offensive coordinator in the NFL and then basically not force the NFL to hire him. As opposed to having to come back to college and prove yourself in college. Though, if you're going to prove yourself in college, there's a great place to prove yourself at, right? The University of Florida. He's obviously young, famous for being excellent when he was with Colorado, helped win a national championship in Colorado. So he sort of knows what it takes. At least he did when he was a player, and I'm sure he would as a coach as well. And so, that offense with Pat Mahomes and Edwards-Hilaire and Kelsey and all those guys, that offense is pretty explosive. Saw it today, actually. And so I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if the enemy got some feelers. But the problem is, again, that early recruiting, the early signing day really throws a wrench if you want to go to the NFL, because if it's a successful NFL coordinator that you're going to go after, you're going to end up with the same sort of timing issues.
Yeah, they're probably going deep into January again in Kansas City. So there's a couple NFL names still got. That's I think a pretty thorough look at the coaching market right now there, Will. And let's wrap up with a dollar with a quick look at the Florida State game on Saturday. Obviously, we missed it in 2020. Love this rivalry game. Always, typically, it's been on Thanksgiving weekend for a long time now. After an 0-4 start at the beginning of the season, which included an embarrassing loss to Jacksonville State and a blowout to Wake Forest, the Seminoles have found their footing in year 2 of the Mike Norvell era, winning 5 of their last 7 games, highlighted by road wins at North Carolina, Boston College this past weekend, and a last-minute victory over in-state rival Miami last weekend. FSU tends to lean on quarterback Jordan Travis to create in the running game. He regularly posts somewhere close to 15 carries a game, give or take a few in either direction, capable of getting over 100. Good runner, can also hit on the deep ball occasionally. The FSU defense, statistically, it's a mid-level team in the ACC, but the Noles surrender close to 30 points a game, 29.4 on average, meaning that the over seems to have a good shot to hit on Saturday, unless Florida figures something out against Missouri. But if the defense that we've seen most of 2021 is back, I think it's a good shot at the over this weekend, Will.
Yeah, I mean, look, Travis is the first time I think this year that Florida's really played a quarterback who has the ability to run quite as much as he does, right? I mean, he's one of those guys who came in as a running quarterback, though he's averaged 8.1 yards per attempt this year, 14 touchdowns, 5 picks, 153 quarterback ratings. So he's actually played really well when given the opportunity. This is not a great Florida State team. You looked at Notre Dame loss. Obviously, they were able to keep it close, but then the loss to Jacksonville State, though that could easily be a win. I mean, that happens on a Hail Mary, but then you lose to Wake Forest, who's better this year than we thought. especially when you look towards the end of the year. Louisville, they lost to. Louisville's not great, but then they beat Syracuse, sort of turned it around there, beat North Carolina, who everybody thought was going to be pretty good coming in. UMass is basically a cupcake. They lose to Clemson, who's a lot better now than I think they were early in the year, lose to North Carolina State, who's a pretty good team, beat Miami, and now beat Boston College. So they beat some solid teams now over the last couple of weeks. And I think that's something that you need to take into account, that Jordan Travis is playing pretty well. If you compare his stats to Emory Jones, they compare pretty favorably. We'll see who Florida decides to play at quarterback. I think that probably decides it, because one of the things that I pointed out in the preview for the Missouri game, and it came true in the Missouri game, was that the efficiency with which the Florida quarterbacks run the ball is really the key stat. And so against Missouri, Emory Jones averaged 2.6 yards per rush. So he had 17 carries, had like 45 yards, but he only averaged 2.6 yards. And if you look at all the wins, they were up around 8 yards per carry, 9 yards per carry, somewhere like that. All the losses, they were at 4, 4.8, 1.6, 2.4, and then 2.6 against Missouri. And so I think that's kind of going to be the battle. As you look at the quarterbacks, it's not necessarily going to be the guy who throws the ball the best. It's going to be the guy who runs the ball the best. And so I think Anthony Richardson has an opportunity to be more efficient, more dynamic, right? You don't necessarily have to be, you don't necessarily have to average 8 yards per rush every rush. You just need to hit the one or two big ones that gives you that 8 yards per rush average. And Richardson seems to have the ability to do that. But obviously he's had some issues staying healthy when he's been on the field when we've seen it. There have been a couple of injuries that have been disclosed in different press conferences recently. How extensive those are, I don't necessarily know, but that to me will be the key. Is with Greg Knox in, does he make a change at quarterback? Does he bring Anthony Richardson and show people what Florida's going to have in 2022? Does he split snaps? Does he have packages? We just don't know, right? There's no way to know what's going to happen. If Mullen was coaching for his job, it'd be pretty obvious, right? He was going to run with Emory Jones the entire time, but now we don't know what we'll see. And that's somewhat a good thing, somewhat a bad thing. It's certainly why Vegas has taken the score, or taken the spread off of their websites. You're not able to bet on it. At least you weren't today after Mullen was fired. But that is one interesting thing, is that Florida was like a 10-point favorite before Dan Mullen was fired. And so that
were they 9-point favorite at Missouri?
Yeah, they absolutely were. At the same time, I think there was a lot of variance in that, because it wouldn't have been a shock if Missouri had won by like 35.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, if the defense had played like they did in the first half against Sanford, that game would have been close. Defense came to play. You wonder if they're going to come to play again. I think it's probably, I don't know. Right. I think they came to play, but did they come to play because they were playing for Mullen, or did they come to play because they were playing for themselves? And that'll be the question that's answered pretty early on in that one. But I think if you look at the running quarterbacks, that's where I'd focus.
Beating Florida State always matters. So let's go out there. Let's beat the Noles. If you would have told me 2 months ago that this FSU game was going to be remotely competitive, I wouldn't believe you. Thought you were crazy. So it's amazing we're at this point. It's amazing we're fighting for bowl eligibility. But I mean, that's what happens on in a season where your coach ends up getting fired before the end of it, I guess. Will, but hey, let's say we talked about a lot of tough subjects this weekend with Dan Mullen going. You had a nice message at the end of your article this morning, on Sunday morning here on Read and Reaction, the Missouri postgame assessment. It's Thanksgiving Thursday, so just want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll send it out with Will's message here from his article on Sunday morning on readandreaction.com.
Yeah, man, it was one of those things. I got a buddy at work who we've got pretty close over the last few years, and he left because the match between him and the company just wasn't good. I wish him well, and I hope he does well. I understand why he left, but at the same time, he's sort of sitting there saying, oh, God, I wish that person was around. And so that's one of the things that I think we hopefully take away from this sort of stuff, is that, one of the reasons that football is so great, one of the reasons Florida football is so great, is because of the relationships that you build. And these are people who sort of start out as roommates when you move in, or end up being people you meet through Twitter, and then eventually become friends, and eventually become family. So, those are the things, the family moments, the time you spend time with your sons, your daughters, and your fathers, and your mothers, watching the games and talking about it, and those sorts of things, right? That's always when I get a kick, is when my mom texts me about something. I knew we were in trouble a couple of weeks ago, because she texted me, is Anthony Richardson going to transfer? And I went, oh God, like if my mother thinks that's a concern, then we know we're in trouble. So those are the things that you're going to remember 10, 15, 20 years from now. We all remember sort of specific things from the 06 season, from the 08 season. But at the end of the day, like it's not those games that really make the difference. Is that they were a shared experience with people out there. And so that's the big thing, right? The Gator standard isn't necessarily going 11-1. The Gator standard is sharing that 11-1 with somebody and with a group of people. And this is an awesome place to do that. So, appreciate everybody's support for the website, appreciate everybody's support for the show, and certainly appreciate your support, buddy, in terms of putting this together. And everybody just remember that, go out, cheer against FSU, and hopefully we end up with a bowl game this year to cheer for too. We only get 13 of these every year. Sometimes we only get 12. Hopefully we get 13. And, you got to enjoy it while it's here, because the years go fast. I have a girl who turns 13 tomorrow. So,
wow.
Those years go fast, and don't take one for granted.
Hey, and especially after last year, just even the fact that you got the opportunity to go to and fill a stadium on Saturday and go watch the Gators take on Florida State after missing it last year. I mean, hey, rough season, but life's doing okay right now. So we appreciate everybody tuning in for the show. Stand Up and Holler. It's been a blast coming to you before all the regular season games wrap up this year. I just want to say that we really appreciate the support. It's been a lot of fun making the show, and we'll be with you all through the off season too. Will, we're not going anywhere, right?
Nah, we're too stubborn. We're going to keep. we have new coaches to harass, so this will be fun.
All right, y'all. Have a great day and beat Florida State. Go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week. And check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.